On the afternoon of Thursday, February 10, 1966, employees of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad were working to clear overgrowth from the right-of-way along the banks of the Ohio River, a routine safety operation which is performed about every 3 years. Early that morning, however, it became clear that this particular day would be anything but routine. North of Moundsville, West Virginia, near the small community of McMecken, the B&O workers made a gruesome discovery. In a small thicket around a tree, they found a set of skeletonized human remains. Later that day, the remains were identified as 42-year-old Isabel Butchko. This fortuitous discovery ended one part of a nearly 3-year-old mystery and served as the beginning of another.
The mystery surrounding the disappearance and murder of Isabel Butchko has now spanned more than 5 decades. Despite the fact that her absence was almost immediately noticed and was then followed by years of both local and national media attention, answers have been scarce to non-existent. Butchko disappeared on the morning of April 23, 1963, yet her remains were not found for nearly 3 years. Why? Butchko was known to keep to an almost timetable-like regiment, yet on this morning, she missed her bus. Why? And most perplexing of all, if Butchko was murdered, who killed her? And again, why? For 53 years now, these questions have not received suitable answers, and both law enforcement and local residents continue to ask, why?
Butchko's father immigrated to the United States from the Austro-Hungarian Empire around 1900. Endy, known for the remainder of his life as Andrew, married Susan Mitchell in October of 1906. Andrew would spend the next 23 years working as a coal miner in western Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia. The numerous factories in the steel towns of Wheeling and Pittsburgh, then running at full bore, were always hungry for more of the black gold. The furnaces burned day and night, turning raw ore from the earth into the stout, rigid metal that was helping to build America into a viable world power. Isabel, the 6th child of Andrew and Susan Butchko, was born in September of 1919. By that time, the family had settled at Moundsville, West Virginia, the longtime home of the West Virginia State Penitentiary. Located merely a stone's throw from the famous Grave Creek Indian Mound, which gave the town its name, the Gothic stone edifice has been a constant, if not always pleasant, fixture of the Ohio River community since 1869. On October 9, 1929, when Isabel was barely 10 years old, her father Andrew, an employee of the Glen Dale Gas and Coal Company, suffered a badly broken leg in a stone fall at the Glen Dale mine. Although injuries such as these were not uncommon, Andrew's forced immobility developed into hypostatic pneumonia. He died 5 weeks later on November 15th. As with so many families in the embryonic days of the Great Depression, Isabel's siblings soon found themselves working to keep the family afloat. Sometime after 1935, Isabel moved to the Kanawha Valley town of St. Albans, just west of Charleston. Here, she found employment as a clerical worker for the state and resided with a family named Gerald. Isabel eventually returned to Moundsville and took up residence with her mother at the family home on 7th Street. Although she was known locally as a friendly and spirited woman, Isabel was something of an anachronism for the times. Seemingly dedicated to her work and her mother, Isabel never married or had a family. Isabel took a job as a secretary at the corrugating division of the Wheeling Steel Corporation, located approximately 16 miles to the north. For Isabel, this meant a daily round-trip bus commute by way of the Cooperative Transit Company. By 1963, the many steel and glass works that dotted the Ohio River from Marietta, Ohio to Pittsburgh were booming. Wheeling, one of the largest cities in the state of West Virginia, second only to Huntington, was as strong as ever. Employment was up, crime was down, and the future seemed bright for energetic go-getters like Isabel Butchko. However, as with much of the so-called Steel Belt, the ride was not to last. At some point on the morning of April 23, 1963, Isabel Butchko mysteriously disappeared. To this day, authorities are still trying to piece together the hopelessly monotone jigsaw puzzle of her disappearance and murder. Isabel normally began each morning by walking the 11 blocks from her home on 7th Street to the bus stop in front of St. Francis Xavier Church on Jefferson Avenue. A devout Catholic, Isabel would often time her walk to allow a few moments to step inside the church before boarding the bus for Wheeling. Butchko's residence was located here, 11 blocks east of Jefferson Street near the Marshall County Fairgrounds. St. Francis Church, where she would board the co-op transit bus, is located here, a straight walk of about 1/8 of a mile through a mostly suburban, middle-class neighborhood. This had been Isabel's routine for a number of years, and, according to members of her family, any deviation would either be reported ahead of time or would result in a phone call shortly thereafter. Witnesses reported seeing Isabel walking west along 7th Street that morning between 6:40 and 7 a.m. The air in April still carried a chill, and Butchko was dressed in a black leather raincoat, a black scarf, and a brown plaid dress. Her normal route of travel took her to within 1 block of the imposing state penitentiary. From the corner of 7th Street and Jefferson Avenue, the tall, ominous guard towers of the town's most iconic structure were plainly visible. When the cooperative transit bus made its 7 a.m. stop at St. Francis, Isabel was nowhere to be seen, a fact that was not lost on veteran co-op driver Sam Harrington. Harrington knew Butchko and later reported to authorities that he found her absence that morning extremely odd. Thinking that Butchko may be ill or simply taking a later bus, the cooperative transit vehicle shut its doors and headed north along U.S. Route 250, recently upgraded to a modern 4-lane highway. Completely out of character, Isabel also failed to show up for work at Wheeling Steel's general offices. Isabel had apparently also made plans to share a breakfast roll with a friend in Wheeling. Her failure to show for both set off alarm bells and prompted a call to Isabel's mother from a concerned fellow employee. Susan Butchko reported that Isabel had left their home at her usual time and had said nothing about running errands or deviating from her regular routine. Susan called Isabel's brother, Michael, and a female friend who lived on Clinton Avenue, not far from Isabel's morning route. Neither had heard from Isabel that day. Later that afternoon, Susan Butchko called family friend and Moundsville Chief of Police George Heinerman. Heinerman wasted no time and ordered a search of the surrounding area. Butchko's description was sent to the Marshall and Ohio County Sheriff's Departments as well as the State Police Barracks in Moundsville and Wheeling. By early evening, news of Isabel Butchko's disappearance was being broadcast to most of the upper Ohio Valley. In Wheeling, city police checked with the cooperative transit company. The drivers on the 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. run from Moundsville to Wheeling were questioned. Both Sam Harrington and fellow driver Bob Reynolds reported that Isabel did not board either of their buses that morning. Routine checks with Wheeling Steel, as well as the local hospitals and hotels between Moundsville and Wheeling, also turned up nothing. By the time the sun was setting over the Ohio Valley, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. The following morning, Marshall County Prosecuting Attorney Everett Cox, along with Chief Heinerman and Deputy Prosecutor Keith Shepard, called a special conference to address Butchko's disappearance. Also participating were Marshall County Sheriff Lawrence Burley and Sergeant Clyde G. Hamrick of the West Virginia State Police. All were in agreement. Something, most likely involving foul play, had happened to the 42-year-old secretary. The search was ordered to be continued and intensified. The area to be covered was large and often sparsely populated. Sheriff Burley dispatched deputies to check with local law enforcement in the towns of Cameron and Glen Dale. Thinking that Butchko may have left of her own accord, a check was made of her bank account. It was discovered that no funds had been recently withdrawn, and Isabel's car, which she normally used mostly for trips and vacations, remained parked in her garage where it had been for some time. Not one to sit on the sidelines, Chief Heinerman himself took to his cruiser and canvassed the neighborhood around Butchko's residence. By nightfall on the second day of searching, he had personally visited each and every home along 7th Street. That same evening, local radio and television stations broadcast reports concerning Butchko's disappearance. For the citizenry of Moundsville, the situation seemed eerily familiar, if no less chilling. Living in the same town with the largest penal institution in the state meant that the threat of escapes was an ever-present danger. By 1963, the process of dealing with escapes had almost become routine. Word of an escape would be quickly broadcast to the surrounding area. The vigilant cooperation of the local populace, along with single, narrow escape routes to the north, south, and west, meant that the vast majority of escapees were back behind bars in short order. The continued media coverage of Butchko's disappearance soon bore fruit, and what had been deep concern soon turned to an even deeper fear. A resident on 7th Street, whom we will call Robert Jones, contacted Chief Heinerman on October 25th. Jones had not been home the previous day when Heinerman had made his canvass of the neighborhood, but was now eager to tell what he knew. Jones reported to Heinerman that on the morning of October 23rd he had observed Isabel walking west along 7th Street towards the bus stop. This was normal. What happened next was not. Ominously, Jones stated that a few minutes later he again observed Isabel walking along 7th Street. This time, however, she was walking east, back towards her home, and she was not alone. According to Jones, Isabel was walking east in the company of a white male whom he did not recognize. Jones described the unknown male as stocky and having curly black hair. He appeared to be only slightly taller than Isabel, who stood at 5 feet 5 inches. Despite early hopes for an identification, Jones was unable to locate the likeness of the man among any mugshots, and the meek description of the mystery man produced no viable leads. The perverse rumor mill, which seems to spring up around cases that garner media attention, soon began to churn. Local, county, and state officials soon found themselves searching one hill and dale after another, following up on what would turn out to be bogus tips. Nothing was ever found, and the investigation into Butchko's disappearance went cold, and was soon to be eclipsed by other national tragedies. Nearly 3 years passed. On February 10, 1966, workers employed by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad were clearing overgrowth along a section of tracks in the upper portion of what is known as the Narrows. It was here that the workers discovered a full human skeleton covered by 2 inches of snow.
Sergeant Hamrick, how was the skeleton discovered?
It was discovered by members of the railroad section crew who were working along the track in the area approximately 1/2 mile south of McMecken. That would be between McMecken and Glen Dale. They saw what appeared to be a skull there on the road bank between the highway and the railroad, and so reported it to the depot officials in Moundsville, and they in turn called us We went to the scene and made a search and found the skull, what appears to be a human skull, and several bones of what appears to be bones of a human body.
Bushes in the area had grown right through the bones, indicating that the body had been at the location for a long period of time. The workers notified the West Virginia State Police as well as the Marshall County Sheriff's Department. Sergeant Hamrick responded to the scene.
Investigating the possibility that this may be Isabel Butchko, who has been missing since 1963.
Yes, sir. She is a missing person from this area, and under such a circumstance, when something like this comes up, we, of course, always check to see whether or not these bones might be those of any missing person from this area.
Amongst the skeletal remains, Hamrick discovered tattered bits of gray plaid fabric, the remnants of what appeared to be a petticoat, and well-preserved hosiery made of weather-resistant nylon. Most importantly, Hamrick found what appeared to be a wristwatch wrapped around the skeleton's left arm. Oddly, no shoes were ever found. Unable to make an identification at the scene, the remains were removed to the state police barracks in Moundsville. That night, Isabel's mother Susan and brother Andrew identified the tattered bits of clothing as those Isabel had been wearing on the day she disappeared. The following day, the skull found in the Narrows was sent to the offices of dentist Harry J. Anderson in Wheeling. Anderson positively identified the skull as belonging to Isabel Butchko. The nearly 3-year mystery of Isabel's disappearance had been solved. However, the discovery of Butchko's remains seemed to raise more questions than answers. Outwardly, the remains exhibited no signs of obvious violence. 4 days after Butchko's remains were discovered, Marshall County Coroner Darrell R. Morris reported that the skull found in the Narrows exhibited signs of damage. Morris reported that the periosteum, a thin membrane which covers the skull, had been broken. According to Morris, the most likely cause was that the skull had been struck by or pushed against a blunt object. Morris also stated that the injury had been inflicted prior to death. Butchko's remains were found here, in what is known as the Upper Narrows. The remains were found near a small tree located between the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad tracks and West Virginia Route 2. The remains were situated about 10 feet below the highway's concrete retaining wall. No weapon or remnants of a weapon were ever found. How did Isabel get from this area, along 7th Street in Moundsville, to here, where her remains were located 2 years and nearly 10 months later? Given the distance, police have stated they feel it is unlikely that Isabel got to the location by foot. They also felt it probable that Isabel died elsewhere and her body placed at the scene around the time of her disappearance. But if this was true, how had her body and clothing gone unnoticed by both railroad and roadway traffic for so long? Police also found themselves at a total loss in terms of any possible motive. Isabel's friends and family could think of no one who may have wanted to harm, let alone kill her. Indeed, authorities were unable to locate anyone who seemed to harbor any kind of grudge or ill feelings towards her. Isabel seemed happy and content in her life and exhibited no signs of being suicidal. Complicating matters even further, higher than expected rainfall struck along the Ohio River from Wheeling to Moundsville in the days following the discovery of the remains. Although not forecast to be a catalyst for flooding, ice backed up in the Wheeling Creek area broke apart and, after being augmented by the heavy rainfall, pushed the Ohio River to a nearly 41-foot crest. Though the overall damage was moderate, manpower, which may have been allocated to follow up on the discovery of Butchko's remains, was instead assigned to far more pressing duties, that of preventing the loss of even more life. Once the flooding threat had subsided, the only real clues police had to go on were the accounts of two witnesses who saw Isabel walking back towards her home on the morning she disappeared, and the vague description of a stocky white male with black curly hair. However, no one reported to know who the man was, and Isabel was not seen entering any vehicle or appearing to be in any distress. Moundsville was stumped. What had happened, and why? Prosecuting attorney Everett Cox felt certain that Isabel's death was a result of homicide, and he did not mince words about it either. Despite Cox's expressed confidence, no new evidence into Butchko's disappearance and murder surfaced. Days turned into weeks, then to months, then to years. In May of 1968, Cox reached out to the general populace for help. In a typewritten letter, Cox made an impassioned appeal for help from the public and the media. 11 months later, Butchko's story was featured in the April 1969 issue of True Police, a popular tabloid magazine which profiled law enforcement cases. Butchko's case was recounted in great detail for a national audience. Even with the renewed interest and national media exposure, the investigation into the death of Isabel Butchko once again ground to a halt and has remained immobile ever since. Everett Cox went on to become a circuit judge in the 2nd Judicial District, although he would never live to see his unwavering confidence justified. He died on September 14, 1974, in Moundsville. Funeral services for Isabel Butchko were held in St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church on February 15, 1966. Reverend Father John Sparks delivered the eulogy. Isabel was laid to rest in Moundsville's Riverview Cemetery. Today, her resting place is marked by a simple marble gravestone. Fittingly, upon her death in 1967, Isabel's mother Susan was buried in the adjacent plot, and the names of both mother and daughter have been etched in stone as they were in life, side by side.
As with all unsolved homicides, the investigation into the murder of Isabel Butchko has never been closed, though the ensuing years seem to have done their very best to turn it to solid ice. Very few clues were found along with Butchko's remains, and police have precious little to go on, save the somewhat vague description of the potential suspect. The best, and perhaps last, remaining hope for a successful resolution may well lie with the passage of time. Law enforcement has long maintained that whoever murdered Isabel Butchko would likely spend the remainder of their days with a tremendous weight upon their conscience. Perhaps, after more than 53 years, that weight will become too much to bear, and the tortured conscience will finally choose to unburden itself.
Isabel Butchko was last seen alive in Moundsville, West Virginia on the morning of April 23, 1963. Between 6:40 and 7 a.m., she was observed walking west along 7th Street towards Jefferson Avenue, and then a few minutes later was seen walking in the opposite direction as if returning to her home. Witnesses reported that when Isabel was walking east, she was in the company of an unknown male, described as having a stocky build, roughly 5 feet 6 to 7 inches tall, with black curly hair. This man has never been positively identified, though law enforcement have stated they feel he may be the key to Isabel's disappearance. Isabel's skeletonized remains were located just south of the community of McMecken on February 10, 1966. No confirmed reports of the remains having been seen during the intervening years have been forthcoming. Police have theorized that Isabel got into a car with someone on the morning she disappeared and may have been killed, then transported to the location where her remains were found a short time later. Clothing remnants found among Isabel's remains were identified as those she had been wearing on the day she disappeared. If you have any information concerning the murder of Isabel Butchko, please contact the West Virginia State Police or the Marshall County, West Virginia Sheriff's Department.